Well, it's time for another story. I called this one Knoxville, Tennessee, our Ricky Scaggs audition. In 1979, I was recently single and living in Laurel Apartments at UT Knoxville. Somewhat at loose ends, I met another resident who introduced me to a couple other folks in the building. One of those was Bill Anderson, a PhD candidate in chemistry, who played the doghouse bass and was a fellow devotee of mountain music. Bill was also in his late 20s and had come back to grad school later than most. In the years since college, he had made his living working construction and was still working construction part-time to support himself in school. Having worked construction for a year myself, I was quite aware that one can meet some very interesting characters. Billy told me that he had a couple of guys, Eward Wilson and Doyle Lawson, who used to work for him, who gathered with him on a Friday night at his apartment to play some bluegrass and other traditional music. Since I knew a few chords and could keep rhythm on a guitar, he invited me to join them for a little picking and drinking, moonshine that is. Eward flat-picked a mean guitar and mandolin as well as supplying the moonshine. Doyle played a respectable three-finger roll on a five-string banjo, and Billy played his doghouse bass. While Doyle and Eward were excellent traditional musicians and very fine fellows, neither had a lot of formal education. Eward was from Cott County, up around Cosby, the ramp capital of the world. Historically, Cott County was legendary for the production of quality moonshine, corn whiskey. Eward's daddy was a well-known and respected distiller of the less-than-legal variety of corn whiskey. In between occasional involuntary trips to Brushy Mountain, his daddy was pretty much a full-time distiller and had never worked at Public Works. One of the more interesting days I ever spent was visiting his still up on Cosby Creek near their home place in Cott County. Mr. Wilson was pleasantly surprised to learn that I could read the bead on a fruit jar of white whiskey, that is, judge the proof or alcohol content of the whiskey by examining how high the bubbles floated on the whiskey in a quart fruit jar. Growing up in Wauhatchie was good for something after all. After I'd known Eward for a while, I finally got around to asking him how he got his name. He said he was named after his father, Edward, but his father only had a third-grade education and couldn't spell all that well. When Eward was born, the doctor brought the birth registry paperwork to his daddy to fill out. He inadvertently left the D out of Edward, thus creating Eward, and Eward he had been ever since. After a few snorts of his daddy's finest libation, particularly a spirited tune, would tend to incite Eward to commence to stomp dancing. After he taught me to stomp dance, we would engage in occasional little stomp dancing duo. Probably not the best practice on the 14th floor of married student housing, as a combination of our enthusiastic playing and stomp dancing had the tendency to attract the interest of the UT campus cops on more than a few occasions. Doyle was from Straw Plains, out in the country about 30 miles north of Knoxville. His family were prominent farmers and die-hard Republicans all the way back to the war between the states. They had a general farm raising mostly corn and sorghum cane, which they sold to the local distillers back in the hills. Eward's daddy had been a customer for decades, and that's how he and Doyle became friends. The Lawsons had an old mule and pressed their own cane for molasses. Nothing quite like a cold evening under a full harvest moon in October, watching their mill turn the cane mill. Then sitting around a wood fire as the cane syrup cooks down in a metal trough into fresh hot molasses to pour over hot cat head biscuits right out of the oven and lathered in butter. Of course, accompanied by some of Mr. Wilson's finest libation. Doyle was their oldest son. He'd worked construction for Billy, but through his daddy's Republican connections was driving a garbage truck for the county. Although slightly stooped, Doyle's topped 6 feet 5 inches and could not have weighed more than 130 pounds wet. He had a bushy head of curly, bright red hair and more freckles than the Milky Way has stars. A couple of teeth were missing up front, and he didn't talk much, but he was an accomplished amateur banjo picker and had a fine mountain tenor. His rendition of Fox on the Run would bring tears to your eyes. One Friday night, Billy mentioned that Ricky Scaggs and his band were going to play the next night at Buddy Latham's Buddy's Barbecue out in West Knoxville. This was before Ricky became famous, but he was already well known in bluegrass circles as one of the best mandolin players then alive. He had debuted at the age of 11 with Bill Monroe, the father of bluegrass music. At this time, he was still only about 25. We all decided to go. We loaded up the next evening in Billy's VW bus and headed to West Knoxville. Ricky was scheduled to start his first set at 7 p.m., but we got there by 5:30. We got a table right up front of the stage. The pitchers were only $1, and by the time Ricky started to play, we may have consumed a few pitchers, that is. Ricky played his first set, and as he took his break, he mentioned that his banjo player was ill and could not come out for the second set. He stepped off the stage, and I went up and introduced myself, and I told him how much I enjoyed his performance. He said thanks and started to turn away. I quickly said, "My friend Doyle over there, he picks the banjo, and he knows all these songs. Maybe he could sit in with you." He stopped and turned back, asking if Doyle had his banjo. I said, "Yes, we just happened to have our instruments in the bus in the parking lot." He agreed to come outside so we could play for him. I went over to the table to tell my folks he was going to consider letting Doyle play with him. Doyle immediately freaked. After we got Doyle kind of calmed down, we went out in the parking lot to meet Ricky and get our instruments out of the VW bus. Ricky asked us what we're going to play, and I suggested, how about Orange Blossom Special, since it's an instrumental and a great banjo tune. Ricky said that sounded good, and we struck up the tune. We started off pretty good, but the longer Doyle played, the more nervous he got and the faster he played. At the end, the sweat was flying off all of us. We were near collapse, strumming like crazy, trying to keep up with Doyle. After we stopped, I asked Ricky what he thought. He took a long pause, saying, "Well, it was an Orange Blossom Special, all right, but don't you think it was a mite fast?" Well, folks, that was pretty much the end of that audition. Fortunately, his banjo player recovered, and Ricky went on to be a big star. The rest of us kept our day jobs, and I guess it usually pays to keep your day job. Thank you.